and becomes business. So many people benefited from what he created. And I acknowledge that. And that's why I see him as legacy.
Documentary, I think a lot of people thought that he was just joking around. It turns out he's not. So this is actually a real project that's being made under his G Unit movie and TV studio, and he's made a bunch of really successful projects.
For years, the industry brushed it off like background noise. Clips people laughed at. 50 Cent has always moved like an outsider when it comes to Sean Diddy Combs' private circle, claiming he knew what was going on without ever being part of it. For years, people brushed his words off as petty rivalry, something personal rather than serious. But now, those same statements are popping back up in a totally different light, one shaped by legal pressure and a culture starting to question everything. That doesn't mean every claim is fact, but it definitely changes how people hear it. Warnings don't always show up with proof right away. Sometimes they sit there ignored, especially when they come from someone people don't want to take seriously. It's uncomfortable to admit, but a lot of early signals get dismissed just because the person speaking isn't convenient. Diddy's reach went way beyond music. He had influence over spaces where careers could take off or completely stall. Justin Bieber being close to that kind of power wasn't random. It reflected how the industry works, where opportunities often move through key figures instead of clear, open systems. What really raises eyebrows isn't just what may have happened behind closed doors, it's why nobody stepped in out in the open. When success depends on staying close to power, boundaries can start to blur fast. So the real question is, who actually has the power to say no, and what happens to the ones who do? Long before Justin Bieber ever stepped into the spotlight, Usher had already spoken about his own experience entering Diddy's world as a teenager. He described being exposed to adult situations way too early, and that detail matters because it sets a pattern, not just random talk. When you start seeing similar paths repeat across different generations, it stops feeling like coincidence and starts raising real questions. At some point, coincidence just doesn't hold up anymore. What it starts to suggest is something deeper, a system that keeps running the same way without real change. If concerns were already recognized once, then why did nothing shift before the next young artist came through? That's the part people can't ignore. As more attention started building around Diddy, a lot of celebrities who were once close stayed completely quiet, while 50 Cent kept speaking louder and louder. That contrast reveals something real about how the industry moves. Speaking out can cost you connections, but staying silent keeps everything intact. Loyalty starts to blur into self-preservation, and it's not always about fear. It's about strategy. In a space where truth can clash with survival, silence can feel like the safest move. But when that happens, where does accountability even fit anymore? Justin Bieber has never come out and accused Diddy of any criminal actions, but his later interviews paint a much heavier picture than people expected. He's opened up about anxiety, losing control, and hitting emotional lows, and that kind of honesty makes the story way more complicated than a simple headline. He's talked about being overwhelmed at a young age, surrounded by powerful adults with their own agendas, while he didn't have the tools to fully protect himself. That detail hits different when you really think about it. This isn't about legal claims, it's about the human side of it. Trauma doesn't always show up with a clear accusation or a single moment you can point to. Sometimes it builds quietly and shows up years later as damage that's hard to even explain. If the issue runs deeper through a system, then why does everything rely on one person stepping forward to make it real? Once Diddy's situation moved into federal court, everything shifted. The conversation stopped being just talk and started focusing on actual legal steps, charges, rulings, and ongoing proceedings, changing what can be said publicly while opening the door to bigger questions about the system itself. Courts deal with specific actions, not the culture around them, and that leaves some of the biggest questions hanging in the air. The reality is simple but heavy. Legal outcomes don't always match moral responsibility, and a cleared case doesn't suddenly undo deeper damage built into a system. So when a courtroom wraps things up and moves on, does that really mean the conversation is over? Or is that where the real questions actually begin? What keeps this conversation alive isn't just the past, it's what it reveals about how the industry still operates today. The same power structures, the same closed circles, and the same quiet rules that decide who rises and who gets pushed aside. Nothing about that system feels accidental. People are starting to question more than ever before, not just specific names, but the environment itself. The deals made behind doors, the influence that never gets documented, and the pressure that comes with chasing success in a space controlled by a few key players. The focus is shifting away from individuals and toward the bigger picture, because even if one story fades, the pattern doesn't just disappear. It stays in place, waiting to repeat itself with someone new. And that's where the tension really sits. If everyone can see how the system works, but nothing truly changes, then what does that say about accountability? At what point does awareness stop being enough and action becomes the only thing that matters? Now the spotlight isn't just on what happened before, it's on what happens next. Because once a pattern gets exposed, people start watching a lot closer, and the pressure doesn't just disappear, it builds. More voices are starting to speak, even if carefully, and that shift alone changes the energy. The silence that once protected everything doesn't feel as solid as it used to, and when that silence cracks, even slightly, it can open the door to questions nobody wanted asked before. At the same time, the industry isn't built to change overnight. Power protects itself, relationships run deep, and influence doesn't just fade because people are talking. That's the reality behind the scenes. So now everything sits in this uncomfortable space, half exposed, half protected. People are watching, waiting, and trying to figure out what comes next. Because if the system stays the same after all of this, then what was any of it really worth? And now the biggest question isn't just about the past or even the present, it's about what people choose to accept moving forward. Because once something gets exposed, ignoring it takes effort. It becomes a decision, not an accident. Fans, insiders, and observers are all looking at the same situation from different angles, trying to make sense of it. Some focus on loyalty, others on accountability, and some just don't want to believe any of it could be real. That split alone shows how complicated this really is. The industry still moves fast, always chasing the next big thing. But these conversations don't just disappear anymore. They stick around, they resurface, and they follow the people involved no matter how much time passes. So the real tension sits right here, between what's known, what's ignored, and what people are willing to confront. Because at the end of the day, the system only changes if enough people decide it has to. And if they don't, then everything just keeps repeating itself again and again. Awkward moments ignored, and questions that never got asked. But now, with 50 Cent's new documentary stirring things up, the whole timeline is getting a second look, and what once sounded like rumors is being dragged straight into the spotlight. Right in the middle of it all sits Diddy, a powerful figure who shaped careers, and Justin Bieber, a young star who stepped into that world way too early. This isn't about random clips or internet chatter. It's about power, silence, and how long things can stay buried when too many people have something to gain by staying quiet. The focus isn't just what was seen, but what wasn't questioned. Justin Bieber's rise was sold as a dream story, but behind the success was a tougher reality. A young artist moving through adult spaces without clear protection. Old footage and interviews show him in environments where fame, access, and influence seem to matter more than age-appropriate limits. For years, people saw these moments and shrugged them off as just celebrity behavior instead of asking deeper questions. The issue isn't pointing to one single moment, it's about what became normal. How did an entire system get comfortable looking the other way when youth collided with power? And more importantly, who is supposed to answer for that cost? At this point, it's not just a story, it's a mirror reflecting how the entire system operates behind the scenes. The same patterns, the same power moves, and the same silence that keeps everything running smoothly on the surface. And once you see it, it's hard to unsee. What makes it heavier is how normalized it all became over time. Things that should have raised concern were brushed off as just how it works, and that mindset allowed everything to continue without real challenge. That's where the real issue sits. Now people are starting to connect the dots in a way they didn't before. Not just looking at isolated moments, but at how everything links together across years and across different artists. That bigger picture changes everything.
He feels like he was wronged by a lot of people around him, and Usher was one of the people that presumably knew what was going on in Justin's life and stood back and said nothing.
Usher is one person who could have understood Justin's point of view because he was a young teen star who became the biggest thing in the world.
So now the question isn't just about who was involved, it's about who allowed it to continue. Because systems don't run on one person alone, and if everyone saw parts of it but stayed quiet, then how deep does that responsibility actually go? Now everything reaches a point where the conversation can't just loop back again. The same questions have been raised, the same patterns have been pointed out, and the same silence has been noticed over and over. At some point, repetition turns into pressure. What once stayed in the background is now sitting front and center, and people aren't as quick to dismiss it anymore. The shift isn't just in what's being said, it's in how seriously it's being taken. That alone changes the entire dynamic. Still, real change doesn't come from attention alone. Awareness can fade, headlines can move on, and systems can quietly reset if nothing forces them to evolve. That's the risk sitting underneath all of this. So now everything comes down to one thing: what happens after the spotlight moves away? Because if the focus disappears and nothing actually changes, then all of this just becomes another cycle that people talk about for a moment and then forget until it happens again. And even now, there's a feeling that not everything has been said yet, like pieces are still missing, stories still incomplete, and details that haven't fully come to the surface. That kind of uncertainty keeps the tension alive. People are watching closely, picking apart timelines, interviews, and moments that once felt insignificant. What used to pass by unnoticed is now being re-examined with a different mindset, and when that shift happens, even small details can start to feel important. At the same time, not every question gets an answer right away. Some things stay unclear, either because they were never documented or because no one stepped forward at the time. That gap between what's known and what's suspected keeps everything in motion, so the conversation doesn't really end. It just evolves. Because as long as there are unanswered questions and unresolved concerns, people will keep digging, keep watching, and keep asking. What else hasn't been revealed yet? At the end of all this, what really lingers isn't just the names or the headlines, it's the pattern that refuses to fade. The same cycle of power, silence, and unanswered questions keeps showing up, and people are starting to recognize it for what it is. This isn't just about one moment or one situation. It's about an environment that allowed things to go unchecked for far too long. And once that idea settles in, it changes how everything is viewed moving forward. There's also a growing awareness that success and protection don't always come together. Just because someone is in the spotlight doesn't mean they had control behind the scenes. That contrast is what makes this conversation hit even harder. So what's left isn't a clean ending, it's an open question that doesn't go away. If the system stays the same, then the outcome will too. And if nothing truly shifts after all of this attention, then what does that say about how much was really learned in the first place? And even with everything laid out, there's still a sense that the full picture hasn't completely surfaced. Like the story people see is only part of something much bigger happening behind the scenes. That feeling alone keeps the conversation from fading out. What's different now is the awareness. People aren't just consuming the story, they're questioning it, looking deeper at how influence works, how access is controlled, and how certain environments were allowed to exist without real oversight. That shift in perspective changes everything. At the same time, not everyone is ready to confront what that might mean, because acknowledging a larger pattern comes with uncomfortable truths about how long it's been allowed to continue, and that's not easy for anyone to sit with. So the tension stays right where it is, between what's visible and what's still hidden, because until every piece is fully understood, the questions don't stop. And the biggest one still hangs in the air: how much of this was seen all along but never truly addressed? Now everything lands in a place where the noise has settled, but the weight of it all hasn't gone anywhere. The headlines might slow down, but the questions stick around, echoing in the background louder than before. That's what makes this moment different. People aren't just reacting anymore, they're remembering, looking back at old clips, past interviews, and moments that once seemed harmless but now feel loaded with new meaning. That kind of reflection doesn't fade quickly. At the same time, the system keeps moving like it always has. New faces, new stories, same structure behind it all, and that's where the real tension sits, between what's been exposed and what continues without interruption. So this isn't a clean ending or a final chapter. It's more like a pause where everything is being watched a little closer than before. Because if nothing truly changes beneath the surface, then all of this becomes just another moment people talk about before the cycle quietly starts all over again. The connection between 50 Cent, Diddy, and Justin Bieber points to something bigger than just individual stories. It exposes how the celebrity system really moves. Power rises to the top, while the risks fall on those with the least control, and accountability always seems to show up late, if it shows up at all. Youth gets packaged as realness, access gets labeled as mentorship, and staying quiet gets treated like professionalism. That's the structure, and it's been running like this for a long time. This isn't about claiming certainty, it's about recognizing patterns that keep repeating. And when the same system keeps producing the same kind of damage, at what point does the system itself become the real focus? If you made it this far, tap like, subscribe, share this with someone who needs to see it, and drop your thoughts in the comments, because this conversation is far from over.